We are, yeah, that's right, pandering. We are honored to have our first presenter this morning address a very important and evolving topic that impacts pediatrics. Dr. Eric Dziuban will present Preparing for Emerging Infectious Disease Outbreaks, Zika, and more. Dr. Dziuban is a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Public Health Service, and he serves as a CDC liaison for the FAAP, Disaster Preparedness Advisory Council. Dr. Dziuban has participated in CDC's response efforts for Ebola, Zika virus, the Flint, Michigan water contamination, and Hurricane Matthew. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Eric Dziuban.
Well, thanks so much, and good morning. It's an enormous honor to be able to present at this amazing conference. It's been so wonderful so far. I'm going to keep it short today to limit our screen time. I'm told that's a good thing. This is my simple outline. First, I'm going to give a rapid history of emerging infectious disease outbreaks that informs our current efforts to protect children. I'll share 3 imperatives for the importance of pediatrician involvement in these efforts, trying to tie in some practical examples of steps that can be taken. Then, I'm going to wrap up with an appeal to take these considerations back to your offices and your exam rooms and incorporate into your work immediately, because really there's no chance that we've seen the last of these outbreaks and the threat they represent. So, let's start at the beginning. Of course, in reality, we'll never know what the first emerging infectious disease was. In a manner of speaking, every infectious disease was emerging at one point in history or prehistory. We have evidence of tuberculosis and guinea worm disease from the mummified Egyptians going back thousands of years. The plague of Athens, probably typhoid fever, diminished the stature of that city and really changed world history. Only a few years later, Hippocrates was describing influenza for the first time. The bubonic plague may have first emerged in the 6th century and almost 650 years later returned as the Black Death. 300 years of recurrent cycles probably led to around 75 million lives lost. During that period, the connection of populations that started around 1492 from America and Europe allowed pathogens like smallpox and measles to emerge in continents that had never seen them. And by the 19th century, the 3rd plague pandemic was causing enormous numbers of casualties in China and India, and included the United States' first plague outbreak right here in the city of San Francisco in the year 1900. Then we come to a moment in modern times that I would argue to be a critical turning point in emerging infectious disease outbreaks, expanding the best and worst possibilities to go forward. In our bicentennial of 1976, the world was on the cusp of eradicating an infectious disease for the first time ever, identifying the last pockets of smallpox on Earth. D.A. Henderson, you can see here, led this global effort in so many ways, and he's rightly seen as an American hero for what he accomplished. And I'm sure many of you heard of his passing just a couple of months ago and saw the many tributes, the well-deserved tributes that poured in. But in this hopeful moment of extraordinary human achievement, a very different story was developing just a few countries away. The Belgian physician and microbiologist, Peter Piot, and his team were working in Zaire, isolating a new virus with frightening lethality. Not wanting to stigmatize the village where the disease had struck, they named it for the nearby Ebola River. In a matter of months, humanity was learning both that we have the ability to end scourges that have plagued us for thousands of years, and also that the natural world holds threats that we never anticipated, for which we must somehow be prepared. Ebola captured our imaginations as this prototype of the scary exotic disease, but its isolated and quick burning outbreaks didn't necessarily lead to widespread preparedness efforts. And yet, in 2014, Ebola found new terrain, as you know, hit a magnitude never seen before, and our thoughts on preparing for emerging outbreaks had to be rewritten yet again. And then Zika arrived. It's hard to believe it now, but it was really only a year ago that most of us heard about Zika for the first time. In December, a simple search in PubMed for the term Zika turned up a mere handful of references. Amazingly, one of these from 1971 actually describes how Zika virus can invade and destroy neural cells in newborn mice. Just imagine making discoveries in some obscure corner of medical science that 45 years later would be the crux of a public health emergency. Today, the study of Zika is no longer obscure. If you search PubMed for the term Zika now, you'll get 1,400 hits published this year alone. And trying to keep up the latest findings of Zika can really feel like a full-time job in itself. This summer, on any one given day, it was possible to hear about a new birth defect associated with Zika in pregnancy, a new country found to have transmission, and a new strategy being attempted to fight the virus. With so much happening at breakneck speeds in this global network of research and public health response, it would be easy for pediatricians to withdraw and determine they don't have a role in this crisis, at least until they're faced with a directly affected patient. I'd like to make the point that this is not true. And I'm going to put forward these 3 reasons that the pediatric provider has an important role to play in preparing for emerging infectious disease outbreaks, even before they occur. The first point, like all of them, is a simple one. We can't afford to wait. Delaying preparations only makes the damage worse. It is essential to invest in preparations that precede the crisis, and pediatricians can help make this happen. I saw this manifest in a powerful way when working in a different role some years ago. I lived in Swaziland for a couple of years after residency, doing children's HIV clinical care with Baylor's Pediatric AIDS Corps. Swaziland is a small, rural, beautiful country with the dubious distinction of having the world's highest prevalence of HIV. While I was there, 31% of adults nationwide were infected with the virus. This too was once an emerging infectious disease. And the current global pandemic would suggest how truly destructive an emerging infection can be if we lag behind in our prevention and preparedness. But one of the many surprises I encountered there was generally a lot of resistance to HIV testing. There was a sense somehow that testing for HIV was somehow inviting it into your life, as if the test itself could bring HIV into being. Now, to my Western ears, of course, this sounded highly superstitious and anti-scientific. But then I considered how my own American culture encounters medicine. Don't we avoid our colonoscopies and our mammograms for much the same reason? Some part of us fears it might work, it might find something there. And what about how we practice our medicine? You don't dare say it's been a quiet night so far when you're on call, right? You might jinx it, bring some crisis into existence. After some time in Swaziland, I came to realize there was one key game changer that could make all the difference in HIV testing decisions. When people learned that HIV could hurt you on the inside before you could see it on the outside, everything changed. It's a simple message. Maybe so simple that we forget to mention it. It's too obvious. But I remember when I once explained it to a group of house mothers caring for orphans in a remote village, and literally every adult and child in their care got into a line to get tested. I think there's a lesson to be learned here for pediatricians as we consider preparedness for public health emergencies. They will happen, and they will hurt us, even if we choose to ignore them until we can already see them in front of us. In fact, the damage will be more severe if we wait until it's already happening, already evident. I really do understand, though, that preparedness work is hard for busy clinicians. There are so many competing priorities. Problems are often unfolding right in front of you. So how can you possibly allot time for the ones that are not yet happening? However, we live in a world of when, not if. Outbreaks will happen. Some, like the next pandemic flu, are nearly a mathematical certainty. And the good news is that preparing for one crisis is in a lot of ways preparing for many. Issues of planning cross specific pathogens and contribute to an all-hazards approach to preparedness. And like vaccines and anticipatory guidance and just prevention efforts in general, our successes are not going to be judged by the events that are witnessed, but the ones that are avoided. It's truly worth the investment. In addition, pediatricians are not only capable of applying this timeliness to their professional preparedness, but you can be key influencers to help families prepare for emerging outbreaks as well. Speaking myself as a member of the public health sector, we really rely on you, the clinicians standing right at that interface of the patient and provider, to carry these preparedness messages to the households where they're needed right now. Second big picture point is this: a child's health is the public's health. We like to say that children are 25% of our population and 100% of our future. And that's true, but they are also a critical and a particularly messy part of our human ecology. Our team at CDC, the Children's Preparedness Unit, is often in the situation of needing to explain why children need particular focus or have specific needs in a disaster. We like to use this graphic to summarize some of the unique attributes of children, especially the small ones, which require us to consider them distinctly in our preparedness efforts. It includes physiologic differences like increased metabolic and respiratory rates that make them more susceptible to many pathogens or toxins, and the behavioral differences like time spent with hands on the ground and in their mouths, which amplify their exposures. In a crowd like this, I obviously don't need to convince you that children's needs are unique and important, but I am compelled to highlight the importance of those children's health issues in the broader work of preparing for and responding to emerging outbreaks. Children are central to these events, and that means pediatricians are too. These issues start early in the way that outbreaks start and spread, and the efforts required to prevent them. Children are deeply engaged in their environments. Now, that's not my exact word choice when I find my youngest son, Cole, with his mouth on the back of his chair in a restaurant, but it's essentially what's happening. And this matters greatly for disease transmission, of course. Whether we're discussing respiratory spread by uncovered coughs, or spread by fomites going in their mouths, or outdoor vectors that they seek out or neglect to avoid, children are highly exposed and highly exposing to pathogens. We remember that patient 0 from the Ebola outbreak in West Africa is believed to be an unfortunate 2-year-old child who was playing in a tree where bats happen to live, and how new strains of influenza often disproportionately attack the young who had no immunity to earlier circulating strains with similar antigenic properties. This heat map here is created from British data, and it really does a fantastic job of representing the degree to which children have so much more human-to-human contact. The x-axis represents the index subjects by age, and the y-axis represents the people with whom they share social contacts, also stratified by age. And what's immediately clear there is how much of our personal contacts are with people of similar ages to us, hence the bright line going up the middle of the graph. And that intense brightness that you can see starting right around age 5 and going through adolescence demonstrates how much more of that contact happens during our school years. The reality is an outbreak that spreads from person to person is going to find an easy path in our children's day-to-day lives. Once an outbreak is spreading, there are further issues to consider too. Although if we wait until the outbreak is spreading to plan for these, it would be counterproductive and dangerous. These topics are going to be covered in more detail this afternoon in the Q&A session that accompanies this presentation. But here's some key aspects. Being prepared with medical countermeasures for children is critical. And this doesn't just include the weight-based dosing and pediatric formulations, but also child-sized triage tools and medical equipment. Infection control practices, up to and including isolation and quarantine, may play an important role in a big outbreak. It will undoubtedly have different considerations for children than for the general population. Let's just take the single issue of parental presence. Some of you may know this arose with Ebola, as hospitals with isolation units needed to decide if or when they would permit parents to be in the room with a child who had suspected Ebola. I listened to staff at children's hospitals describe how the meetings to form these policies would lead to open crying in conference rooms. And this was before there was even an actual child in question. Just the hypothetical situation and the potential for separating a parent from their suffering child was emotionally overwhelming. We cannot wait until the patients are in front of us needing split-second decisions. Finally, it's worth remembering that the need for children's plans won't necessarily end when the outbreak does. Unfortunately, Zika is providing an all-too-easy example of this right now. Children affected by congenital Zika virus infection are going to have needs and are especially going to need the partnership of their pediatricians for many years after this is no longer considered emerging or newsworthy. My third and final main point to make is that preparedness needs to go local. Not to say that local stakeholders don't already have many ongoing preparedness activities, including for emerging outbreaks. But what we hear over and over again is that the missing component is often the connection between the pediatricians and the public health officials in those local efforts. The pediatricians are usually unaware of what preparedness steps are being taken in their communities. And the public health professionals aren't clear on what role the pediatricians will be playing in the event of an outbreak or some other public health emergency. And notice that I said what role the pediatrician will play, not could play. The reality is that your position on the front lines of children's health guarantees that you will be playing a role in these events, whether you've prepared for it or not. So what local efforts can you do that make a difference? Well, some will start within your clinical practice. Being astutely aware of unusual trends you're seeing in your population is crucial, or maybe manifestations that may be new for a pathogen already in circulation. Think of the pediatricians at Recife, Brazil, sounding the alarm on a surge of cases of microcephaly like nothing that they'd ever seen before. You can also take steps to ensure that your clinical practice is well connected with other children's advocates in your community, like the education sector, childcare networks. It'll expand your awareness, and it'll help your ability to respond to them. Important efforts can be taken outside your doors as well. Go visit those stakeholders you've connected with and offer some basic training in infection control practices that they can undertake. Again, simple messages like the difference between routes of transmission for different diseases can be points of confusion in the community. We can also participate in local healthcare and disaster coalitions. Besides learning some new things and meeting some interesting people, firefighters like my father or teachers like my wife, you're going to provide valuable input through making sure that children's health needs are included in all stages of planning. I like this sign just a couple blocks from the White House because it accidentally declares that pediatricians and children need to be given a strong voice in these spaces. And it's your role to provide it. This is just one specific example of the sort of step you can take to meet this need for connecting your community's pediatric leaders and public health authorities for preparedness planning. This idea was the basis for an exercise that CDC and AAP facilitated earlier this year as we were seeking innovative ways to try to help stimulate these connections. There's perhaps thousands of emergency exercises or drills conducted every year, but we estimate that less than 1% of them are focused on pediatric needs. For ours, we focused on collaborative strategies, communication between sectors, and dispensing of medical countermeasures for children. The states of Federal Region 6 were invited for this initial run in Atlanta. Not everyone from those states, just a few, but it really went well. We walked through a mock smallpox scenario and asked the teams to work together to respond to it, integrating measures to specifically address kids' needs. An exercise like this affords you the chance to bolster communications, improve decision-making, and work through specific outbreak control strategies, such as ring vaccination and quarantine, that are going to require intensive multi-sector collaborations. And it was actually fun, and that never hurts. So these are the key ideas that I've been able to draw from these recent emerging outbreaks. I'll be happy to talk more this afternoon about some details as we look at Zika and the outbreaks to come. But I'd like to end with a lesson I learned from my own child. In the most intense days of creating the initial infant Zika guidelines back in January, there were plenty of us staying late and working through weekends. And I vividly remember one Sunday morning where I was getting ready to leave for work at the same time my wife and sons were about to head to church. My oldest son, Ezra, was 3 years old at the time and got confused. He asked me, wasn't I going to church with them? I said no. I explained simply there were a lot of mommies getting sick. I was working to help the babies in their tummies so they wouldn't get sick too. Now, Ezra likes predictability. I was expecting an argument about how I should stay with them like I was supposed to. But instead, a big grin broke out on his face. And he said, wow, that's really good, Daddy. And he went along on his business. He understood at 3 years old, in a way that I don't always manage to accomplish, the face value priority of preparedness and response. It was simple. If his dad could be helping those people, it was good enough for him. When I saw him again the next evening, he asked for an update on the mommies and the babies. And I know that decades from now, I'll still have to account to him and his brother and his cousins and all the other children growing up right now. All of us will have to answer for what we are doing as pediatricians to help children be healthier, to be safer, and have a better chance in this world. I'm really proud to be a part of this group of people and to work in the dynamic space of pediatrics and public health. I think we're going to have some good answers for them. Thank you.